Notwithstanding the glorious resistance of the Spaniards and the varied success of our armies in Spain, the emperor had kept a part of Prussia in his hands and established the center of his military position in the north at Hamburg, which was entrusted to the care of Marshal Davout. The marshal deserved the emperor's confidence by his noble conduct at Jena and by an unbounded devotion. The conditions of the Treaty of Tilsit in regard to England were only to remain in force for 3 years. The Emperor Alexander was perplexed by the state of his trade. The produce of his empire remained on hand, the English refusing to receive it, and the great landowners of the country, who were noblemen, complained. In a government where the life of the sovereign is frequently exposed to the effect of conspiracies, it is perhaps more dangerous than in other places to wound the passions and interests of the great, as it is not necessary there to stir up the people, while 3 or 4 ferocious rebels and a handful of soldiers may decide the fate of the sovereign and the empire. This consideration has certainly a due influence on the new determination of the Emperor Alexander. He was, besides, but little satisfied with his ally Napoleon. The rigor with which Prussia had been used displeased him, and the sovereignty of Italy vexed him. The dominion of the French in the latter country and the possession of the 7 Venetian islands, situated so near Greece, made him fear a watchful and terrible enemy. If ever he wished to resume Catherine's old plans in regard to the Ottoman Empire, he therefore began by degrees to seek a reconciliation with England. His conduct greatly displeased the emperor, who strongly felt the consequences of it. All the powers of the continent had suffered severely. Russia alone still preserved all the energy of her immense strength. The emperor resolved to attack her. He did not, however, carry his resolution into effect without having first exhausted all means of conciliation. But when he saw how stubborn the enemy remained, he opened the campaign. The Emperor Alexander imagined he had disposed all things favorably. But the first attacks were so vigorous that he soon grew sensible. He should be obliged to make one of his last resources and sacrifice everything if he wished to get the advantage in this giant's strife. He began by making peace with the Turks. Unfortunately for France, the Emperor Napoleon thought the Divan would be too well aware of its true interests to conclude a peace with its mortal enemy at a moment when that enemy was going to be so powerfully attacked. He thought that the Divan, according to its old maxims, leaving the Christians to weaken one another by their wars, would profit by their exhausted state, either to attack them or at least obtain that degree of rest which would ensure safety. The emperor sent off his ambassador, General Blank, too late, and when he arrived at the Turkish frontiers, he learned that peace had been concluded between the Ottoman Porte and Russia. Napoleon had another enemy in Bernadotte, Prince Royal of Sweden, whom he had thought attached to his interests. I never could conceive why he remained so unconcerned at that general's exaltation. He was perhaps not sorry to get him out of France, and accustomed to obtain everything by force and despise old diplomatic maneuvers. He certainly had no idea that Bernadotte would be in a situation to injure him. However, the Prince Royal of Sweden laid down a plan of resistance, such as the most inveterate enemy of France could scarcely have imagined. To his natural policy as Prince of Sweden, he added his hatred of Napoleon, which made him give able and fatal advice to Russia, and General Moreau was recalled with a view of being placed at the head of a Russian army and invading France at the head of a party. The campaign, which had begun in so brilliant a manner and which with a little more prudence the emperor would have concluded in good time, owed a part of its disasters to the fatal conviction of Napoleon that his enemies would always yield and that accumulated humiliation would never produce anything but ineffectual fury. I have often heard it repeated that the King of Naples greatly contributed to our misfortunes by keeping the emperor in a fatal security. The Russians caressed that king. They intoxicated him with perfidious praises, which unfortunately had too much power over his mind. He was, they said, the hero of the French, the Du Guesclin, the Bayard of his age. He was the prop of the throne and the support of national glory. It was with him alone that they would consent to treat. Every concession that could be made without danger, they would offer to him, happy if he deigned to accept their terms. The return of a courier sent to the Emperor Alexander was looked for with impatience, and then peace was to be immediately signed. The King of Naples, who had already entered into private engagements with Russia for the preservation of his Neapolitan throne, was delighted by finding in the Russians a fresh security. He therefore kept the emperor in an illusion, which, to say the truth, he shared himself, though the still burning ruins of Moscow ought to have taught them that a sovereign capable of taking such a step would never sign a disgraceful peace. In fact, the Russians were already preparing to harass, by all possible means, the French army in its retreat. The disasters of that campaign are known. While they were going on, the city of Paris witnessed a prodigy, such as is often seen on the eve of the great convulsions of nature, what all Europe in arms had not dared to plan for the last 20 years, namely, the conquest of Paris. A single man in prison without friends, money, or reputation was bold enough to attempt and almost succeeded. I had served with Mallet as staff officer in 1793. He was a man of an extraordinary turn of mind. His manners were eccentric, and he was tormented with a deep melancholy that made him morose and disagreeable to his comrades. The ascension of Bonaparte to the throne had displeased him, and he had not attempted to hide his feelings. The loss of his liberty, added to the grief of seeing his career stopped when so many officers of younger standing than himself rose to the highest rank and acquired great reputation, made him take a part in an ill-conceived conspiracy consisting of those old remains of brawling Jacobins who take no counsel but their rage and have no means of realizing their wretched projects. Mallet was discovered, and the particulars of the plot having been laid before the eyes of the emperor, he shrugged up his shoulders through contempt. After some years' imprisonment, Mallet obtained leave to remove to one of those private hospitals, Maisons de Santé, which surround Paris, and which were for the police a sort of seminaries, where they kept, subject to a severe supervision, all such persons who could not be convicted, but whom, however, it would have been dangerous to set entirely free. We had remained during 26 days without any accounts from the army. Sinister reports were beginning to circulate when Mallet, after having combined his plan with the Abbé Constant, a companion of his captivity, found means to get out of prison, dressed in a field marshal's uniform, and went at 4 o'clock in the morning to the barracks of the Municipal Legion. Having called up the colonels, who was still asleep, he told him with an air of dismay that the emperor was dead, that the Senate was assembled to restore the Republican government in France, that he, Mallet, who had been appointed commander of Paris, wanted 600 men of the regiment to go to the Hôtel de Ville and protect the Senate that was assembling there. At this fatal news, the colonel was at first seized with alarm, and his grief for the death of the emperor made him shed tears. The disorder of his mind did not permit him to reflect on the news he had heard, nor cast his eyes on the suspicious person that stood before him. He ordered the guard to assemble, and, overwhelmed with consternation, left Mallet master of his forces. The name of a republic, which recalled to mind licentiousness, was a counterpoise to the death of the emperor. The most brilliant promises and temptations were held out. The officers all believed what Mallet chose to tell them. Each soldier was to be rewarded by advancement and double pay. The officers were to get drafts of the treasury of 20 and even 50,000 francs for Mallet had provided against every difficulty. He soon got together 400 men, at whose head he went to seek his accomplices, and the future ministers of France in the prison of La Force. In that prison, there had been in confinement for some time an adjutant general named Guidal and General La Hourée, of whom I have already spoken. Both had served with Mallet, but had heard nothing more of him, and were totally ignorant of his plans. Mallet entered the prison, claimed his 2 old comrades, and told the great news. The jailer refusing to deliver his prisoners, he signed their liberation, introduced 200 men, and went to La Hourée's chamber. The first words Mallet said to him were, "You are the Minister of Police. Rise, dress yourself, and follow me." Poor La Hourée, who now saw for the first time during the lapse of 12 years a man whom he had never looked upon as quite compote, sane, imagined all he heard was but a dream, and rubbed his eyes while looking at him. At last, the assurance of the death of the emperor, of the assembling of the Senate, of the reestablishment of the Republic convinced him that he was once more witnessed another of those revolutions so common in modern history. He rose, dressed himself, and found 600 men at the gate. With Guidal by his side, he immediately went to the Minister of Police, who was still in bed. The soldiers entered quietly and without any obstacle. When finding the door of the minister's chamber locked, they broke it open with the butt ends of their muskets. The minister, waking at the noise, jumped out of bed and without waiting to dress himself, rushed upon the murderers. He was seized and treated in the most brutal manner. But at last, at sight of the prisoner La Hourée, and the intelligence of the death of the emperor, he began to comprehend that he was the victim and the dupe of a revolution. He obtained, not without some trouble, leave to dress, and Guidal led him, escorted by a detachment, to the prison of La Force. On the Pont Neuf, he jumped from the cabriolet, but was retaken. When he arrived at the prison, the jailer burst into tears. Savary whispered to him, "Place me in your darkest dungeon and hide the key of it." God knows what is the meaning of this, but it will all clear up. A few minutes later, the prefect of police was also brought to the prison. A detachment had gone to fetch him and had dragged him along. Whilst the head of the police were thus treated, Mallet went to General Hulin, commander of the military division and of the city of Paris. The general was just getting up to receive an order from the minister of the War Department, which could be delivered into no hands but his own. Mallet was accompanied by some officers of his troop. On seeing the general, he said to him with the greatest coolness and with an air of gravity, "I am very mortified, General, to have so painful a commission to execute, but my orders are to arrest you." Hulin remonstrated, and looking at Mallet, whose face he knew, he said, "How, Mallet, is it you? You arrest me, a prisoner? How did you come here? What is your business doing here?" "The emperor is dead." These words struck Hulin dumb, and Mallet repeated the fable he had invented. However, the arrest and the order to go to prison appeared wondrous, strange to the general. He continually spoke of the death of the emperor and his own imprisonment. At length asked Mallet to show him his order. "Very willingly," replied the other. "Will you step with me into your closet?" Hulin turned round, and as he was entering the closet, he fell, struck by a bullet that touched his head. While lying on the ground, he saw his murderer looking coolly at him and preparing to fire once more, but thinking him dead, he left the place. He crossed the Place Vendôme and went to the staff, whither he had sent before him a letter acquainting the Adjutant General N. that he was advanced to the rank of Major General. The latter, when he saw Mallet, could not disguise his doubts, struggling between his duty and his ambition. He was perhaps at the point of yielding and entering into arrangements when one of the heads of the military police, the old Colonel Laborde, came into the apartment. The appearance of that man showed sufficiently that he could neither be deceived nor seduced. Mallet was therefore going to blow out his brains when Laborde seized him abruptly by the arm, called for assistance, and had him arrested. This Laborde was an old soldier who, having long retired from active service, had chosen Paris for his camp and the scene of his observations. Attached to the police under all possible governments, no one could impose upon him by illusions. His youth had been passed in vice, and he now felt pleasure in pursuing it in its last holds. He made use of his privilege with all the despotism which subalterns of that class love to exercise upon the rabble. Rank, titles, glory, virtue, crime itself is sacred to them as long as it remains prosperous. But as soon as the day of misfortune arrives, they trample upon everything, and neither respect nor pity must be expected from them. Laborde had seen Mallet in prison. At the first report of the Minister of Police being arrested, he set himself at the head of a platoon of infantry, went to the office, and found La Hourrie calmly seated at his desk, writing orders after those he had given at the Hôtel de Ville. He had him immediately seized and tied to his armchair, while he addressed to him reproaches that opened the unfortunate La Hourrie's eyes in the madness of Mallet. He then went to the staff, where he arrested the latter, and flying to the prison, he delivered the minister and prefect of police. The prefect went home, but his hotel being still full of the soldiers who had arrested him, they pursued him, and he was glad to find a refuge in a neighboring house. All these scenes, well deserving of a place in the Arabian Nights entertainments, happened between 5 and 8 o'clock in the morning. By 9, all was over. And the happy inhabitants of Paris, when they awoke, learned the singular event and made some tolerably good jokes upon it. The attempt of Mallet was nothing more than the extravagance of a madman whose imagination had been excited. It made, however, a deep impression on the public and became a subject of dismal reflection. In the following year, the Royalists did not fail to place Mallet among the number of their martyrs, and honored with the name of a Bourbonian attempt, the mad freak of a man who, far from ever having belonged to that party, had always been worked upon by Republican ideas. His plan was a sufficient demonstration of that. He had planned the assembling of the Senate. He had spoken of nothing else to the soldiers than the reestablishment of liberty and the Republic, and he could only hope to succeed by stirring up the lowest classes of the people. Would the confusion have been considerable and long enough for him to have succeeded in case the emperor had really been killed? I do not believe it, but at least I must suppose, from the knowledge I had of his character, that he would not have fled, but would have committed suicide. The noble firmness he showed until the moment of his death is proof of that. A few days after he had been arrested, news was received from the emperor. He was by no means disconcerted and expressed no other feeling than that of regret for the loss of liberty and the prolongation of the emperor's despotism. The most incredible thing was that in the midst of the confusion, during 3 hours, nobody thought of the empress or her son. The prefect of the department had quietly slept at his country seat in the forest of Vincennes. He was coming home on horseback when an express met him and delivered to him a note wherein he found, written with pencil, these 2 words: Fuit Imperator. At first they appeared inexplicable. The express had not waited for an answer, and it was only after a good deal of reflection and after having read the note 4 times that he at last understood it. He hastened to the Hôtel de Ville, where he found everything in confusion, and General La Hourée already giving orders for the assembly. He then burst into tears and found no other resource but submission. The colonel, who first had been surprised by Malet, did not show either more firmness or more presence of mind than the prefect. All those who had been surprised by the news carried their reflection no farther. It seemed as if everything was over by the death of the emperor, and that he had taken along with him not only the secret of the government, but all the foresight and energy of those who were devoted to him. There is not the least doubt. But 2 hours later, everyone would have come to their senses, but then perhaps it would have been too late. I did not conceal this observation from the emperor, who looked very grave when he heard it. Generals Malet, La Hourée, and Guidal, who were arrested a few hours after the rest, and about 15 poor officers who had committed no other fault than obeying generals, whom they looked upon as their leaders, were condemned to death. In going to the fatal spot, these officers cried, "Long live the emperor." They all died with a courage bordering on indifference. Several of them were not killed in the first discharge, and they reproached the soldiers for their awkwardness.